The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled in their seats, the polished wooden benches reflecting the warm afternoon light filtering through tall windows. In the center of it all sat Judge Andrew Cole, a man known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense attitude. His graying hair was neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room with the kind of authority that demanded respect. He was a stickler for rules, a firm believer in the law's ability to maintain order, and someone who rarely second-guessed his judgments. Today was just another day, or so it seemed. The docket was full, the usual mix of minor infractions and civil disputes. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least not until the next case was called. Judge Cole adjusted his glasses, glancing at the file in front of him. His expression hardened as he read the details. It was a simple case on paper. A parking violation. A black woman, late 30s, had been ticketed for parking in a restricted zone. The fine was substantial, and she had chosen to contest it rather than pay. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room stood as Judge Cole entered. He nodded, taking his seat, and motioning for everyone to sit. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman stepped in. She walked with quiet confidence, her head held high, a calm but determined look on her face. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, she moved with a kind of grace that turned heads, not flashy, not ostentatious, but undeniably commanding. Her name was Maya Brooks. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as she made her way to the defendant's table. She didn't seem fazed by the weight of the moment or the eyes on her. She had been here before, though not in this capacity. Today, she wasn't standing behind a lectern, delivering arguments or cross-examining witnesses. Today, she was the one being judged. Judge Cole's eyes narrowed as he studied her. There was something about her presence that was different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it unsettled him. He cleared his throat, shifting his attention back to the paperwork. "Miss Brooks," he began, his tone clipped and formal. "You're here to contest a parking violation issued on the 14th of last month. Is that correct?" Maya nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor." There was a pause. Judge Cole tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythmic sound echoing in the stillness. He didn't like being challenged, especially not over something as trivial as a parking ticket. But Maya's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel his irritation. "Do you understand the nature of this infraction?" he pressed. The vehicle was parked in a designated no parking zone. The signage was clear. "I understand, Your Honor," Maya replied evenly. "But I believe there are circumstances that warrant reconsideration." Judge Cole raised an eyebrow. "Circumstances." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Enlighten me." Maya took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. The area in question is adjacent to a public park. On the day in question, I was there to meet with a community group concerned about environmental hazards affecting that park. My vehicle was parked temporarily with the hazard lights on while I assessed the site. There was a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, in Judge Cole's eyes, but he quickly masked it. "This isn't a debate about environmental concerns, Miss Brooks. It's about whether or not you violated parking regulations." Maya didn't flinch. "I understand that, Your Honor. But I believe the law should also consider context. That's why I'm here." Judge Cole tapped his pen again, more forcefully this time. He wasn't used to defendants speaking with such poise, especially not in cases like this. "Context doesn't excuse breaking the law," he said curtly. "You parked illegally. The fine stands." Maya remained silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then, in a calm voice, she said, "May I speak to the importance of the work being done at that site, Your Honor? I believe it may provide clarity." Judge Cole sighed, glancing at the clock. He didn't have time for grandstanding, but something about Maya's tone made him pause. Reluctantly, he gestured for her to proceed. Briefly, he warned. Maya nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. The park in question sits on land that has long been neglected. It's home to several species of plants and wildlife that are now endangered due to encroaching development. The community has been fighting to preserve it for years, but recently there have been reports of toxic runoff affecting the soil and water. My visit that day was part of an ongoing effort to gather evidence and push for remediation. There was a murmur from the gallery, and Judge Cole's expression softened slightly. He leaned forward, studying her more closely. "And what, exactly, is your involvement in this matter, Miss Brooks?" Maya met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm an environmental lawyer, Your Honor." The room fell silent. Judge Cole blinked, taken aback. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. The weight of her statement hung in the air, shifting the dynamics of the courtroom. He glanced at his notes, then back at Maya. Suddenly, the case didn't seem so straightforward. "What law firm are you with?" he asked, his tone less confrontational now. "I work independently," Maya replied. "My practice focuses on environmental justice and advocacy." Judge Cole nodded slowly, processing this new information. The rigid lines of his face softened, but his expression remained guarded. "Even so," he said after a pause, "the law is the law. Your profession doesn't exempt you from following it." "I'm not asking for exemption, Your Honor," Maya said gently. "I'm asking for understanding." The room held its collective breath as Judge Cole considered her words. His gaze flicked back to the file, then to Maya. He could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken tension that had filled the space between them. This was no longer just about a parking ticket. It was about something bigger, something that challenged his own perceptions of justice and fairness. He exhaled slowly, setting his pen down. "I'll need some time to review the details," he said finally. "Court is adjourned for now. We'll reconvene tomorrow." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the courtroom buzzed with renewed energy. Maya gathered her things, her expression unreadable. As she walked out, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Judge Cole watched her leave, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Something told him this case wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind a stillness that lingered in the air. Judge Cole remained seated, lost in thought. The room, once bustling with voices and footsteps, now felt cavernous and silent. His fingers drummed lightly on the wooden bench as he stared at the now closed case file. Something about Maya Brooks unsettled him, not in a negative way, but in a way that gnawed at his usual sense of certainty. He wasn't used to being questioned, not like that. Most defendants either paid the fine or made flimsy excuses. But Maya had come prepared, calm and articulate, with a quiet conviction that was hard to ignore. Judge Cole shook his head and rose, gathering his papers. He told himself it was just another case. Nothing more. Outside the courthouse, Maya walked down the marble steps, her heels clicking with each step. The crisp autumn air was sharp against her skin, and she pulled her coat tighter around her. She could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her, but she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago how to mask her emotions, to present a steady front even when the world seemed determined to push her off balance. She paused at the bottom of the steps, glancing around. The city hummed with life, cars honking, people rushing by, their faces a blur of determination and fatigue. Maya took a deep breath, letting the noise ground her. She knew today had been just the beginning. The real battle would come tomorrow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a familiar name on the screen, Jasmine. Maya smiled faintly and answered. "How'd it go?" Jasmine's voice was warm and reassuring, like a blanket on a cold night. Maya sighed. "As expected, the judge isn't exactly sympathetic, but I think I got through to him." "Maybe," Jasmine chuckled softly. "Well, if anyone can, it's you. You have a way of making people see the bigger picture." "I hope you're right," Maya replied, her voice tinged with wariness. "This isn't just about the ticket. It's about setting a precedent. If we can get the court to recognize the environmental impact, it could open doors for more cases like this." "And you'll do it," Jasmine said confidently. "You always do." Maya smiled again, feeling a flicker of hope. Jasmine had been her rock, her constant support through years of uphill battles. They had met in law school, bonding over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of making a difference. Jasmine had gone on to work in corporate law, but she never lost touch with Maya, always cheering her on from the sidelines. "I'll keep you posted," Maya said, glancing at her watch. "I need to prep for tomorrow." "Don't work too hard," Jasmine warned. "Remember to eat." Maya laughed softly. "I will. Talk soon." She hung up and slipped the phone back into her pocket. As she walked towards her car, her mind raced with thoughts of the case. She knew it wasn't just about convincing the judge. It was about the bigger fight ahead. The park was more than just a patch of green space. It was a symbol of what was at stake, a reminder of the delicate balance between progress and preservation. Maya's thoughts drifted back to her first visit to the park. She had been called in by a local community group, concerned about a strange smell coming from the nearby creek. When she arrived, the sight had been heartbreaking. The once clear water was murky and discolored, with a faint chemical sheen on the surface. The air was heavy with the scent of something toxic, something that didn't belong. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, working with environmental scientists and community leaders to build a case. But the wheels of justice turned slowly, and every step forward felt like a struggle. Still, Maya refused to give up. She knew what was at stake, not just for the park, but for the people who lived nearby, the families who relied on that space as a sanctuary. As she drove home, the city lights blurred past her window, a kaleidoscope of color and movement. Maya's mind remained focused, running through legal arguments and possible strategies. She knew Judge Cole would be a tough nut to crack. His reputation preceded him, a man of principle, but also someone who clung tightly to the letter of the law. He wasn't known for his flexibility. But Maya had faced tougher challenges before. She had stood in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her, where every word felt like a gamble. And she had won. Not always, but often enough to know that persistence paid off. Back at her apartment, Maya set her briefcase down and sank into the couch, exhaling deeply. The space was quiet, filled with the soft glow of lamplight. Her eyes drifted to a photo on the mantel. Her parents, smiling proudly at her law school graduation. They had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. Their support had been her anchor, guiding her through the storms of life. Maya reached for her laptop, opening a folder filled with case files and notes. She needed to be ready for tomorrow. The stakes were too high to leave anything to chance. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Cole sat in his study, a glass of scotch in hand. The room was dimly lit, lined with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. He stared at the file on his desk, Maya's name printed neatly on the front. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. His thoughts wandered back to their brief exchange in court. There had been a fire in her eyes, a quiet determination that reminded him of someone. He couldn't quite place it, but it nagged at him like a memory just out of reach. Cole took a sip of his drink, his mind drifting to his early days as a young lawyer. He had once been filled with that same sense of purpose, that belief in the power of the law to effect change. But years on the bench had worn him down, replacing idealism with pragmatism. Still, something about Maya had stirred that old spark. He wasn't sure why, but he knew one thing: tomorrow would be interesting. The next morning, a soft drizzle blanketed the city, casting a grey hue over everything. Maya stood by the window, watching the raindrops streak down the glass. She sipped her coffee slowly, lost in thought. Today was crucial. She knew that. The case wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger, something that resonated with her deeply. She turned away from the window and walked over to her desk, scanning the documents spread out before her. Each page told a story: testimonies from community members, environmental reports, photos of the park before and after the damage. She had spent countless hours piecing it all together, making sure every detail was accounted for. Her eyes lingered on a photo of a group of children playing near the creek, their faces lit up with joy. It was taken years ago before the contamination. Now that same spot was off limits, the water too dangerous to touch. Maya felt a familiar pang of frustration. How did it come to this? How had something so pure been allowed to deteriorate? She was still deep in thought when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Patel, one of the community leaders she had been working with. Asterisk, good luck today. We're all rooting for you. Asterisk. Maya smiled faintly and sent a quick reply, grateful for the support. By the time she arrived at the courthouse, the rain had eased into a light mist. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet pavement. Maya pulled her coat tighter around her as she made her way inside, the familiar weight of her briefcase swinging at her side. The courtroom was already filling up when she entered. She noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd. Members of the community who had come to show their support. They nodded at her, their eyes filled with quiet hope. Maya felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just her fight. It was theirs too. Judge Cole entered moments later, his expression as unreadable as ever. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and glanced at Maya. There was a brief flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He cleared his throat and called the session to order. Ms. Brooks, he began, his tone measured. You mentioned yesterday that the circumstances surrounding your parking violation were unique. I've reviewed the documents you submitted, but I'd like to hear more from you today. Maya stood, her posture straight and confident. Thank you, Your Honor. As I mentioned, the park in question is facing severe environmental threats. The day of the violation, I was there to assess a report of toxic runoff affecting the creek. My vehicle was parked temporarily while I gathered evidence. Judge Cole nodded slowly. And this evidence, what did it reveal? Maya took a deep breath. The water tests confirmed the presence of hazardous chemicals. We believe these are linked to a nearby industrial site. The community has been pushing for an investigation, but progress has been slow. There was a murmur from the gallery, and Judge Cole held up a hand for silence. His eyes remained fixed on Maya. I understand the community's concerns, he said carefully. But my role here is to determine whether your actions violated parking regulations. I understand, Your Honor, Maya replied. But I believe the law should also consider the broader context. My actions were in service of protecting public health and safety. Judge Cole tapped his pen thoughtfully against the desk. Public health and safety, he repeated. A noble cause, Ms. Brooks. But are you suggesting that anyone engaged in such work should be exempt from following the law? No, Your Honor, Maya said firmly. I'm suggesting that the law should have room for discretion, that it should recognize when a minor infraction serves a greater good. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering her words. He was about to respond when the courtroom door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped in. He moved quietly to the back of the room, but his presence didn't go unnoticed. Maya recognized him immediately. Mr. Jameson, a lawyer for the industrial company linked to the contamination. Maya's jaw tightened. She had expected this. The company had been watching her closely ever since she began investigating. They had deep pockets and a team of high-powered lawyers, ready to pounce at the first sign of trouble. Judge Cole noticed the man as well, his eyes narrowing slightly. Ms. Brooks, he said, returning his attention to her. Do you have any witnesses who can speak to the conditions of the park? Yes, Your Honor, Maya replied. I'd like to call Mr. Patel to the stand. Mr. Patel, a quiet man in his 60s, made his way to the front of the courtroom. He took the oath and sat down, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Maya approached him with a reassuring smile. Mr. Patel, she began, can you tell the court about your experiences with the park? Patel nodded. I've lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, he said. The park has always been a place for families, for children to play. It's a part of our community. But in recent years, we've noticed changes. The water started smelling strange. Plants began dying. People started getting sick. There was a collective intake of breath from the gallery. Maya pressed on. And what actions have you and the community taken in response? We've filed complaints, Patel said. We've reached out to local officials, but nothing happened. That's when we contacted Ms. Brooks. She's the only one who's listened. Maya felt a lump in her throat but kept her focus. Thank you, Mr. Patel. She turned back to Judge Cole, who was watching with a thoughtful expression. Before he could speak, Mr. Jameson rose from his seat. Your Honor, may I request a brief recess? Judge Cole frowned but nodded. 5 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Maya felt Jameson's eyes on her. He approached, his smile cold and calculated. Impressive performance, he said quietly. But this isn't over. Maya met his gaze, unflinching. No, it's not, she agreed. And I'm not backing down. Jameson's smile tightened. We'll see. Maya watched him walk away, her mind racing. The fight was far from over, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier when the recess ended, tension settling like a dense fog over the room. Maya could sense it in the way people whispered in hushed tones, the way their eyes flicked nervously between her and the opposing counsel. She took her seat, folding her hands in her lap to steady herself. This was the moment she had been preparing for, but the stakes felt higher now, more precarious. Judge Cole returned to the bench, his expression unreadable as always. He glanced at both sides, then nodded for the proceedings to continue. Ms. Brooks, you may proceed. Maya stood, her mind racing as she adjusted her blazer. She could feel Jameson's gaze on her, but she refused to be intimidated. This wasn't about him. It was about the community, the park, the people who had placed their trust in her. She took a deep breath and turned to face the courtroom. Your Honor, I'd like to present additional evidence, she began, her voice steady. These are photographs and water quality reports from the site, documenting the deterioration over time. She handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to Judge Cole. He'd flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he examined the photos. The images were stark. Dead fish floating on the surface of the creek, plants withering at the water's edge, children playing in areas now marked with warning signs. This is concerning, Judge Cole murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He set the papers aside and looked up. Mr. Jameson, do you have a response? Jameson rose smoothly, a practiced smile on his face. Your Honor, while we sympathize with the community's concerns, there is no conclusive evidence linking our client's operations to the issues at the park. Environmental changes can result from a variety of factors, many of which are beyond our control. Maya's jaw tightened. She knew this tactic well: deflect, deny, sow doubt. But she wasn't about to let him shift the narrative. Your Honor, with all due respect, the company has a history of environmental violations. There are records of fines and citations for improper waste disposal. Jameson's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Old news, Ms. Brooks. My client has since implemented significant reforms. Reforms that conveniently don't address the ongoing issues. Maya shot back. The community deserves better than vague promises. Judge Cole held up a hand, silencing both of them. Enough. I've heard enough from both sides. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This isn't a trial about environmental law. It's a hearing about a parking violation. Let's keep that in mind. Maya bit her tongue, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. She had come this far, and now it felt like the rug was being pulled out from under her. But she couldn't afford to lose her composure. Not now. Your Honor, she said carefully, choosing her words with precision, I understand the scope of this hearing. But I believe it's important to consider the broader implications. This isn't just about a ticket. It's about the principle of standing up for what's right, even when the system makes it difficult. Judge Cole studied her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. There was a palpable tension in the room, every eye fixed on him, as they waited for his response. He sighed, tapping his pen against the desk. This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning, he announced. I'll take the night to review the evidence and consider my decision. The gavel came down with a decisive crack, and the room erupted into a flurry of movement. Maya exhaled, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She gathered her papers and made her way outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief after the stifling tension of the courtroom. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed. It was Jasmine again. "How are you holding up?" Jasmine asked, her voice laced with concern. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "It's hard to tell which way the judge is leaning." "You did your best," Jasmine said. "That's all you can do." Maya nodded, even though Jasmine couldn't see her. "Yeah, I just hope it's enough." They talked for a few more minutes before saying their goodbyes. Maya leaned against her car, staring up at the darkening sky. The city lights flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the streets. She felt a deep exhaustion settle in, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. The next morning came too quickly. Maya arrived at the courthouse early, the anticipation gnawing at her. The courtroom filled slowly, people trickling in with quiet murmurs. Jameson was already there, his expression as composed as ever. He gave her a curt nod, which she didn't bother to return. Judge Cole entered, and the room fell silent. He took his seat, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room. After careful consideration, he began, his voice steady. "I've reached a decision." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything hinged on this. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Judge Cole's voice cut through the silence, measured and deliberate. "In reviewing the facts presented, it's clear this case is about more than a parking violation. It involves the community's right to advocate for its environment and the complexities of balancing legal technicalities with broader societal issues." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "However, the court must adhere to the law. Ms. Brooks, while your cause is commendable, the law was broken. I have no choice but to uphold the citation." A wave of disappointment rippled through the room. Maya felt her stomach drop, her mind racing. She had anticipated this outcome, but hearing it aloud still stung. Her supporters exchanged worried glances, their earlier optimism dimming. Judge Cole lifted his gavel, ready to adjourn, when Jameson suddenly stood. "Your Honor," Jameson began, his voice smooth, yet charged with intention. "Before we close, I'd like to request an injunction against Ms. Brooks and her team to cease all investigative activities at the industrial site. Their interference could compromise my client's operations." The room erupted in whispers. Maya's eyes widened in shock. This was a calculated move, a preemptive strike to halt any further action on her part. She clenched her fists, feeling the walls closing in. Judge Cole looked taken aback, but motioned for silence. "On what grounds?" the judge asked, his tone skeptical. Jameson smiled thinly. "We have reason to believe Ms. Brooks' activities border on trespassing and disruption of private property." Maya shot to her feet. "Your Honor, that's absurd. We've conducted all investigations legally, with proper permissions." Nevertheless, Jameson countered smoothly, the potential for harm exists. "I'm simply advocating for caution." Judge Cole frowned, clearly uneasy with the sudden turn. He glanced at Maya, then at Jameson. "I'll need to review any evidence before considering such a request. We'll reconvene tomorrow." With that, the gavel came down again, signaling an adjournment. Maya felt a mix of anger and frustration boiling inside her. This wasn't just about silencing her. It was about silencing the community and protecting corporate interests. She gathered her things, her mind already formulating a plan. Outside, the crowd had gathered, waiting for news. Mr. Puttle approached, worry etched on his face. "What does this mean?" he asked quietly. Maya forced a reassuring smile. "It means they're scared. And scared people make desperate moves. We're not done yet." Jasmine called as Maya walked to her car, her voice sharp with concern. "I heard what happened. They're really going after you now." "Looks like it," Maya replied, unlocking her door. "But I'm not backing down. They want to intimidate me, but it won't work." "Be careful," Jasmine warned. Jameson plays dirty. "I know," Maya said, sliding into the driver's seat. "But so do I when I have to." That evening, Maya pored over her notes, looking for any gaps Jameson might exploit. Her apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of her laptop. She felt the weight of the community's trust, the urgency of their plight. There was no room for error now. A knock at the door startled her. Maya frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late. She approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, Judge Cole stood on the other side, his expression unreadable. Maya hesitated, then opened the door. "Judge Cole," she said, trying to mask her confusion. "This is unexpected." "I won't stay long," he assured her, "but we need to talk." Maya stepped aside, letting him in. He took a seat, looking around her modest living room before speaking. Off the record, he began, "I wanted you to know I admire your dedication. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." Maya sat across from him, waiting. He leaned forward, hands clasped. "My daughter. She was an environmental lawyer, like you. Passionate, driven. She fought battles just like this." Maya's breath hitched. She hadn't known this about him. "What happened?" she asked softly. Cole's gaze dropped. "She lost one of those battles. It broke her." He sighed deeply. "I don't want to see that happen to you." "I'm not giving up," Maya said firmly. "I can't." Cole nodded slowly. "I figured as much. Just be careful. The system doesn't always play fair." He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Maya walked him to the door, her mind spinning. His words lingered long after he left, a mix of warning and encouragement. She knew she couldn't afford to dwell on sentiment. The fight was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for the first time in days, Maya felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this battle. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a charged energy that Maya could feel in her bones. The community had turned out in full force, their presence a testament to the importance of the fight. Maya walked in, her head held high, every step measured and deliberate. Jameson was already seated, his expression smug, as if he knew something she didn't. But Maya had her own cards to play. Judge Cole entered and took his seat, his face as composed as ever. "Before we proceed with any new motions, I have reviewed both the original case and Mr. Jameson's injunction request." He glanced at Jameson, then at Maya. "Ms. Brooks, you may present any final arguments." Maya stood, her palms resting lightly on the table. "Your Honor, I want to emphasize that this isn't just about me or a parking violation. It's about holding those in power accountable. The community has a right to clean water, safe spaces, and to be heard. Silencing us with legal threats only deepens the divide." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. We'd followed every legal protocol. Our work isn't disruptive. It's necessary. Denying us the ability to continue is not only unjust, it's dangerous. Judge Cole nodded, his eyes flicking to Jameson. "Mr. Jameson." Jameson rose, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, while Ms. Brooks' sentiments are touching, the law is the law. We must protect private property and prevent any actions that could be seen as interference." Maya's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. The judge sat back, contemplating. "I've made my decision regarding the injunction," he said finally. "There is insufficient evidence to justify halting Ms. Brooks' activities. The request is denied." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Maya felt her knees weaken but remained standing, her heart pounding. She had won this round. But just as the tension began to ease, Jameson stood again, his expression shifting to something colder. "Your Honor, if I may," he began, his voice carrying a calculated edge. "There is one more piece of information the court should be aware of." He handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Maya frowned, her stomach knotting as she watched Judge Cole's eyes scan the page. "Ms. Brooks," the judge said, his tone cautious. "It appears there's a pending investigation into your firm's compliance with certain regulatory practices. Care to explain?" Maya's mind raced. This was a blindside, a tactic designed to cast doubt on her integrity. I'm not aware of any investigation, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. But if there is one, I'm confident we've done nothing wrong. Jameson's smirk deepened. Perhaps, but until it's resolved, can we truly trust the motivations behind her actions? Judge Cole sighed, clearly frustrated. This court is not the place to litigate that issue. For now, I stand by my decision. Ms. Brooks, you are free to continue your work. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck with finality, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. Maya exhaled, the tension finally releasing. She turned to Mr. Patel, who gripped her hand tightly, tears in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered. You've given us hope. As Maya stepped outside, the sun breaking through the clouds felt symbolic. The fight wasn't over, but this victory mattered. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, especially with Jameson's looming threat. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Jasmine was waiting by her car, grinning. You did it. We did it, Maya corrected, pulling her friend into a hug. But there's still a lot to do. Jasmine nodded, her expression turning serious. I looked into that investigation. It's bogus. Jameson's fingerprints are all over it. Maya's eyes narrowed. Of course, he's not done with me. No, Jasmine agreed, but neither are we. As they drove away, the city stretched out before them, filled with both challenges and opportunities. Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle for justice was far from over, but she was ready. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone.